Good day to you, students. Our first lecture of the semester takes a look at the age of exploration and the making of the modern world. So I invite you to take notes as we go through this lecture. I invite you to listen to this lecture first, then do the reading, then engage with our discussion, which for this week is called Conversing with the Past. As you remember, each and every week, you will listen to the lecture, do the reading, and then jump onto the Open LMS website and write a response to a question. This week's question is a broad one. In what ways were the European encounters in the Americas a triumph, tragedy, or something else altogether? So we'll deal with sort of ethics and the complexity of European encounter in the Americas. This week, we will look at kind of 5 topics over the course of the next hour. We'll look at the Asian-centered world with a special focus on the Chinese Admiral Zheng He. Then we'll look at the making of the European-centered world, right? Here, Cristoforo Colombo, right? Christopher Columbus gets a shout out. We'll then shift over to Mexico and to the Andes, and we'll look at the world of Hernan Cortez and Pizarro. We'll look at the reality of this encounter, right? How did this happen? Finally, we'll look at the life of Bartolomé de las Casas, and we'll discuss questions of human dignity amidst, in many ways, a really tragic encomienda system. All right, up first, the Asian-centered world. At the beginning of this class goes from the year around 1500, right? Or 1492, if you want to be iconic to the present era. At the beginning of modernity, the Asian-centered world was really connected to the rest of the world, right? Marco Polo and Rabban bar Suma had traveled back and forth from both sides. But if you look at this map, this is sort of the known connected world in 1492. At that time, the center of sort of creation and population was in East Asia, right? Just look at this list of the most populous cities in the world, right? You see Beijing, you see cities in India and Egypt and Guangzhou in China, right? The only European city that gets a mention is Paris, with a mere 185,000 persons. Back then, Paris was really kind of a fire pit hot zone. Fast forward to the year 1900, 8 of the 10 most populous cities are in Europe and America. If you jump forward to today, that center of gravity is once again shifting back to the Asian world. But when you live in a society that can create a huge population, there's a certain center of gravity that's in your midst. Now, this Asian-centered world was dominated by the Ming Empire. We're not going to go into the weeds of the Ming Empire, but you should know that the Ming Empire was incredibly prosperous, right? China was really the center of the global economy. If you look at this map, you can see everything from cotton, tea, sugar, silk, cannons, right? Paper, and silver and spices coming out of this world into South Asia and into the West. As a matter of fact, we'll soon learn that when Europeans first arrive in China, it's the Portuguese, and they're really excited to trade with the Chinese, and the Chinese look at the Portuguese wares and they're like, you have nothing what we want. Everything we create in our society is better than what you create. So this is really the center of the global economy. Here we see some lovely porcelain. All right. And this is a world that's creating magnificent structures, right? From the Taj Mahal, Agra, India, and so forth. So this is really the center of culture and civic life back when Europe was still sort of emerging. Now, I want to tell you the story of a Chinese admiral named Zheng He, because he leads a series of expeditions that proved to be really formative and influential for sort of the course of human events. In 1405, when the Ming Dynasty launched a series of expeditions led by actually a Muslim admiral. This is an individual who had tested well. In China, there was a huge, elaborate testing regime, very similar to the world of the ACTs and SATs in the United States. He was up to the top of the ranks. He's sent to the Forbidden City in Beijing. He's castrated because he's Muslim, and he's castrated because they don't. They want him thinking about his legacy being tied to the empire, not necessarily to his own particular children's future. And this is a period when China is projecting itself into the world. So they launch a series of treasure fleets. Over 317 ships were constructed. They had 2,800 soldiers, diplomats, sailors on board these ships. Here you can get a sense of the majesty of these ships with silk sails. And that small ship right there in that image, you can see, I believe it's the Santa Maria. That's Columbus's ship. Just so 70 years before Columbus is doing his thing, this is what China is doing in South Asia. This is one of the greatest ships. It had 9 staggered masts, 12 silk sails, all designed to demonstrate the grandeur of the Ming Empire. Truly a magnificent armada. Right? They had complex maps. Here you can see kind of a map of the ocean currents to move them in and around the islands. And what's fascinating is that there were 3 major voyages, right? To Indonesia, to India, all the way to Mogadishu and to the Arabian Peninsula. This is a period in history in the early 1400s where, today we look at, let's say, Mogadishu in Somalia in East Africa, and it is tragically a difficult region, right? Pirates and so forth, lots of corruption. I don't want to stay here in stereotypes, but 500 years ago, this was the center of entrepreneurial activity. This is where the action was. If you were a young business person, you'd want to be hanging out in Mogadishu. But what's fascinating is that because China was so wealthy, because they created pretty much everything in-house, these voyages were not so much about trade, rather they were about tribute. So they'd go to these different villages and nations and regions, they project their power. Locals were expected to give a firstborn son of the chieftain to get an education in Beijing, also to kind of be wedded to the regime. And they would give, treasure to the Chinese. But that wouldn't come close to offsetting the cost of this huge, expensive expedition. And there was a decision that was made in 1433. The bureaucrats in Beijing canceled the expeditions of Zheng He. The navy is dismantled. The records are erased. And instead, they're focusing on the Great Wall of China, which they complete to their record. But they're more worried about security than about projecting their influence. Now, listen, these were very expensive expeditions. But one can ask what would have happened had China continued to look outwards into the world and not sort of retrenched amidst wall building and so forth. Right? By the 1760s, a time when we have modern maps and everything, this is the wheel map from China. Now, they did have more advanced maps at this point, but the thesis, the argument that this map makes is that China, the holy city of Beijing, is a center of the universe. Fast forward to 2021. China is once again resurgent, as we'll get to in about week 14 or week 15 of this semester. Since 2012, they've had a general secretary of the Communist Party known as Xi Jinping, who in his official image right here looks very winsome, right? He looks very, quote unquote, Western. He could be, my congressman for all that matters. He's wearing a modern suit. You can see the wall in the background. There's the modern communist flag. And what's fascinating is in China, once again, they're resurrecting the story of Zheng He. who in many ways had been forgotten in history. All across the ports of China, they're building these sort of replica Disney-like treasure ships that tourists are heading to. And you can imagine the reason for this, right? Once again, China is a world's power, and they're perhaps admitting their mistake. Retrenching in 1433, closing the exploration fleet maybe wasn't the best idea, as China begins a long and slow decline over the next 500 years. This is a map of their Belt and Road Initiative. Once again, China is saying, let's dig into what Zheng He did 500 years ago. We're going to invest in the world, and this time we're not going to back down. At least that's the argument that's coming out of Beijing. So watch the story in the next 10, 20, 30 years, really the rest of our lives, as they attempt to revive Zheng He. Now, I would like to turn my attention over to the European-centered world. Oh, it's me, I'm back. I'm just testing the software, folks. I'm sorry, let me make myself small again. All right, I'm in the corner. Listen, the Age of Exploration, made most famously by Christopher Columbus, is a story of extraordinary energy, in some sense, even malevolent energy. It's this remarkable moment where Europeans sort of intrude into the rest of the world. It's really the first European-based colonization of the world since the Roman times. And it brought with it the needs to integrate a whole bunch of people, roughly 20 or 30 million people in North and South America, into some sort of European political and religious system, re Christianity. It produced many new religious techniques, mainly confession and the Inquisition, the tragedy. It spread Christianity from its European and Middle Eastern centers to all over around the world. It produced modern social science, in a sense, as Europeans tried to make sense of the new world in an intellectual context. And this is a moment in which Europe becomes the center of the world. And it's going to remain the center of the world until World War I, possibly World War II, when America takes the reins. All right. So you can see this energy in this a map of this age of exploration. It's a remarkable period that lasts for around 30 years, from 1488 to around 1522. Begins in 1488 when Bartolome Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. No easy task. Vasco da Gama does the same a decade later. Columbus, for reasons I'll get to in a moment, goes in the other direction to get to the same place. Amerigo Vespucci, after whom this continent is named, visits the Brazilian coast in 1519. That same year, Hernan Cortez lands in Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula. By 1522, Magellan, or I should say Magellan's fleet, he died en route, managed to go around the world. Now let's see why this happens and how we might understand it. And listen, this is a really big deal. In places like Lisbon, they've completed a sort of Statue of Liberty, right? This immense monument to the discoverers. So you can see why, even though this perhaps is a slightly forgotten story in our own culture, this is still a very big deal in other places in the world. And now I want to sort of start by looking at maps. The study of maps is called cartography. There's still a lot of work to be done in cartography, especially mapping the ocean floors. There's lots of jobs here. Just check out Google Maps, for example. They employ a number of people there. But if you look at this map, I want to do a few slides on the sort of evolution of cartography. Okay, so this is the Hereford Mappa Mundi. It's from the 13th century. It's only rediscovered, I believe, in the 1970s. You can go visit this huge, 40 by 40 meter map in England. It's absolutely humongous. But this is a map that's more about the cosmos. It's about the natural order. Jerusalem is at the top of the center circle. East is on top, showing the Garden of Eden and a circle at the edge of the world. It's looked over by Christ and the angels, so the intellectual core of the earth is the holy city. So it's a conceptual, coherent schema in which the earth is connected to the Garden of Eden, which is connected to a divine history. Each part is an allegory of the other part. Now, Aristotle, the ancient Greek, is a major philosopher of this worldview, where everything fits together, right? And eventually, many Europeans think of Native Americans, quote unquote, as fitting into this Aristotelian schema. They see them fitting into the world as natural slaves. They are less than women. Their bodies are made to be servants. Europeans ask, why do you think they're generally short? They're good for mining in the ground for us. So there's a lot of beauty in this, but I want to also talk about the real tragedy that occurs when you have this hierarchical system. Now, this is sort of the medieval imaginary, the medieval worldview, so to speak. But things advance rapidly in Europe. By 1492, the city of Nuremberg, which becomes very famous as holding fascist rallies 500 years later, they're very entrepreneurial, and they think it might be a good thing to have a map of the world. So the energy is actually in the cities, not necessarily from monarchies. The commission of the Nuremberg City Council pays a good bit of money for a map maker, Martin Beheim, to create this map. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see sort of a drawing of this map. Now, take a look close at this. You can see Africa over there. Just north of Africa, you can see Hispaniola, or Spain, and England. And off the coast, you can see some islands, the Azores, the Canary Islands, where to this day there's really great surfing. Beyond that, in the middle of the world, you can see St. Brendan. That's a mythical island. Europeans believe that there was a monk who went west and founded a mythical Christian civilization. But beyond St. Brendan, you can see Sekangu, which is known as Japan. And beyond that, China. Now, this is actually a world that's quite close. Now, listen, according to this map, Japan is only located 1,500 miles from Europe. This is obviously not true. But you can see why in a few years, Christopher Columbus, who's working with knowledge from this map, is thinking, maybe I can go west. Speaking of Christopher Columbus, this is his map, drawn in 1490 in the Lisbon workshop of Bartolome and Cristoforo Columbus. Right. Again, here you can see sort of an overlay of what Columbus is thinking, how he thinks he can make it to China. Again, Japan, Shipangu is very, very close. Maybe just a week after going to the Antilles. But we know the rest of the story, right? By 1507, things are beginning to take shape. Hermann Waldseemüller, a German mapmaker, sort of the Randy McNally of that period, he's putting the world together. And this is a very scientific world. If you look at this map, which is available at the Library of Congress, it's majestic, and they only recently opened this up to the public. So I hope you, when you're in DC, right behind the Capitol, there is the Library of Congress. Go there, check this out. But on the far side of this map, you can see a long, thin continent. Now, Waldseemüller labeled this continent America, in part because it rhymed with Europa, Africa, Asia. It had sort of a lyrical quality to it. But he also didn't like Columbus. Rumor has it that he had dated his cousin, who dumped him, and he was okay with this Amerigo Vespucci guy who eventually goes to Brazil. So the name sticks. Everyone else follows Hermann Waldseemüller's lead. And here you can see a close-up of the word America in this map. By 1595, we're getting extremely accurate maps of the world. And just for comparison's sake, right, the Chinese revert back to this. Over in Japan, yes, they have maps of the modern world, but the importance is on what's going on culturally, not what's going on scientifically. So a lot of scientific energies coming out of Europe. So next, we'll look at the question of why are Europeans pushing out of Europe? And I'll give you 3 reasons. First, they're doing it for economic reasons. Most importantly is that the food in Europe is really, really poor. Now listen, many of you live in the Asheville region. Asturias' population is booming. It's booming in part because there's a lot of good food here. If you become really wealthy, one thing you might spend a good bit of your money on is eating well. Eating well matters. For that matter, we're living in a blessed period. If someone from the 13th century walked into my pantry, they'd think I was an emperor with all the spices I've collected, right? But in Europe, food is really bland. I mean, imagine eating without sugar, which doesn't really appear until the Caribbean ramps up its production, or eating without salt from Africa, or cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from Java and Sumatra, nutmeg from Borneo, cloves from Thailand, pepper from India, etc., etc. The Europeans are also interested in silk, right? The great fabric of the rich until the 1800s. They're interested in porcelain, both of these coming from China. So they're doing this because of economic desires. In Europe, after the Black Death of the 1400s, there's this real sort of energy. There's this real desire for living a better life. And listen, traditionally, Europeans had access to better food and these spices by the overland route, right? This is the Marco Polo route, where you start off in Venice, you head to Constantinople, and what is today Turkey, this gateway to the east. From there, you head overland with camels and so forth into the heart of China. You might take a ship from India to Arabia and so forth, but this is sort of the traditional route. Now, something happens in 1453, one of the most important dates in human history, that blocks European adventures in Asia. And that is that Constantinople, right, which was the home of the Byzantine Empire, technically the Eastern Roman Empire, they fall to the Ottomans, a Muslim empire based in Turkey. And when the Ottomans take over in 1453, they basically cut off European trade routes. They're essentially saying, okay, listen, all you Marco Polos, you can do this, but it's going to cost you. Taxes are high. And it becomes prohibitive. There's no way for anyone to make money. So there's this race to figure out how to get to Asia to make some cash. Here's a lovely map of the Byzantine Empire at its height and to where it was by 1453. So the second idea is geopolitics. And what's fascinating is that in Portugal, they're the first ones to say, let's go around Africa. They were aided by navigation developments, new technology borrowed from, among others, the Persians. They developed tacking, that's sailing against the wind. They're using the compass, the astroblade, which determined latitude. They're combining Greek and Arab knowledge, Muslim, and they're hiring Muslim mariners and their own, of course, extensive experience. Their new ship is also important. The ship is called the Caravel. It's got gunpowder from China. It's got cannons, small enough to go on ships. And this becomes the classic vessel of exploration, a sort of castle-like defense on the high seas. And they figure out how to go around Africa. No easy task. Turns out at the Cape of Good Hope, right, and what is today South Africa, there's really turbulent winds that generally push you down into the Antarctic. So a lot of people have died through human history trying to cross the region. But they figure out if they go in the spring, the winds shift, and they actually boomerang you up into India. So they figure out how it works. So Portugal goes east, and they also say nobody else can go. So the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, the Italian ships, they're all blown out of the water if they attempt the African route. So the race is on as Portugal begins minting money as they make contact in East Asia. Spain decides to go west. And this story has to do with Christopher Columbus. Now, Columbus is a fascinating figure. He's the son of a weaver. He lives in Genoa, which is in Italy. So he's Genoan. That's his identity. He's a pretty educated guy. He gets this idea, which is instead of clinging to the land, he's going to go west and set out into the unknown Atlantic Ocean. He takes the team to some German entrepreneurs. They're like, no, dude, we can't fund this. He goes to the King of Portugal, gets nowhere with the Portuguese saying, we're already going around Africa. He then goes to the King of Spain. So it's this remarkable renaissance of marketplace ideas. And that's Ferdinand and Isabel. These are some pretty rough, tumble, powerful kings that had recently united Spain and kicked tragically, the Jews and the Muslim populations out of Spain. And they're kind of like the mafia bosses, they give Columbus money, but he's got to deliver. They're hoping for a lot of gold coming out of the New World. So they risk the adventure. Columbus goes west. And he goes west for a third reason, and that is, oh goodness, Catholic political ideology, or at this point, you could just say Christian ways of thinking. So in medieval political theology, all newly discovered lands belonged in theory to God. So they're at the disposal of God's vicar on earth, which is, any guesses? It's the Pope. It is the Pope. The Pope would then give them as fiefs in this medieval sense to some monarch. In return, the monarchs promised to convert new peoples to the true faith. So partly Columbus plays into European economic rivalry and politics, but Columbus is also driven by bringing Christ to new lands. He actually thought this would bring about the second coming and a new era of heavenly time on earth. So in one sense, he's very much part of the modern world, this Renaissance world. On the other hand, he's very much implicated in this medieval worldview, right? This world of this particular map of the world, the Hereford Mappa Mundi. So Columbus goes west. He makes contact. We're not going to get in the weeds of this story. But immediately afterwards, there's a problem. How will Europeans divide the New World up? So in 1494, the Pope calls a meeting between, basically Spain and Portugal, and they draw a line called the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and they say, listen, all lands west of this line belong to Spain. So listen, today if you travel to Mexico or to Peru or Argentina or Chile, they speak Spanish. And Portugal got all lands east of this. So heavy influence in Africa, influence in, look at that, Brazil. What language do they speak in Brazil? Portuguese. All the way to India. Now listen, the Portuguese eventually lose their influence in East Asia, especially to the Dutch and the British. But this is the way the world is divided. When Columbus eventually makes landfall and encounters Indians, he plants a cross to indicate the spiritual purpose of the voyage, and he read aloud a document proclaiming the God-given sovereign authority of the King and Queen of Spain. But Columbus has a problem. He doesn't find tons and tons of gold or spices in the Caribbean. He thinks he's on some islands off the coast of China. He's convinced of this until his death, actually. But he's in trouble. He's borrowed a lot of money from Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. What is he going to do? He freaks out. And he notices that the geography and the weather is very similar to the geography and weather of the Azore Islands off the coast of Africa, which is pretty close to Portugal. And there they had begun creating sugar. Now, the creation of sugar is an extremely arduous process. And it's really, really dangerous. So they begin to convert the Caribbean islands into sugar plantations, right? And Europeans are awash with the ability to now make pies. They're awash with rum and so forth. But for reasons we'll go into, many of the local inhabitants, the Taino Indians, die mostly from disease. And you need new laborers. Where do you get these laborers? Slaves from Africa. This begins the incredibly tragic period in human history, where eventually 6 million slaves are brought to North America, 4 million to the Caribbean, 2 million to Brazil. So there you have it. Beginnings of the slave trade. And this is also why I might say Columbus Day, here on the slide you can see a title called Past and Present. Every once in a while I throw out these blue colored slides where we kind of jump to the present. Columbus Day is a national holiday. You don't get your mail on Columbus Day, but you might have school depending on where you're at. it's very controversial, right? Because with Columbus, you also have, you know, a great period where many local Americans die. Um, Upwards of 90% of the population over the course of a century. So you can see why, as this picture from the 1980s demonstrates, um, the Native uh, American population, so to speak, has pushed against Columbus Day. But I might add, Columbus Day is also fascinating because Columbus Day becomes a holiday in 1933. In 1933, the people pushing to make Columbus Day a holiday are the Italians. And you know what? The Italian community in America, right, especially up in New York, New Jersey, they were not viewed as fully American. They were considered, not white, so to speak. So when they won this holiday under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, it really was sort of a victory, like a mainstreaming of Italian identity. So if you ask me, I think we should cancel Columbus Day. Sorry for that word, but turn it into immigration, because it's ultimately about welcoming immigrant communities, the Italians, into America. That's one way of perhaps solving this issue. Okay, so that's the story of how Europeans make it into America. A story of extraordinary energy, courage, with some really tragic side effects. We're going to look further south now and kind of continue the story of these encounters in Mexico, right? And we'll here talk about the Spanish conquest. If you'd like, you're welcome to pause the video, as I will now, for a brief moment to grab some water, grab a bite to eat, and I'm back. We're going to talk about the Spanish conquest and about epistemology, about how do we explain the Spanish conquest. Now, first, before the Spanish were here, in central Mexico, there is a people group, an empire indeed, known as the Aztec Empire. Its capital was Tenochtitlan, which was as populous as Europe's largest city. And you'll read a source document by Europeans just being amazed at this beautiful city with its outskirts connected with a mosaic of floating gardens producing food for the earth markets, with canals constantly being irrigated by the land, waste being used as fertilizer. Just tremendously high yields were easily transported into markets. But at the time of European contact in the early 1500s, the Aztec Empire was under stress. Right? Conquering people was not a peaceful thing. And if you know something about the Aztecs, they practiced human sacrifice. So there were a lot of people groups in Mexico that were very upset at the evil empire, so to speak, the Aztecs, at the time of European arrival. Right, here are some more images of the splendor of Tenochtitlan, right? A land that had arguably up to 25 million peoples. When the Spanish saw it, it was also wonderful. They didn't know how to describe the first glimpse of it. They talked about they'd never dreamed of seeing something so magnificent in their lives. But as I said, the Aztec Empire was built on conquest, and people paid tribute in the forms of crops, of silver, of textiles, and also human sacrifice. The Aztecs believed the great god of the sun required the human hearts to keep on burning, and the blood to replace that given to the gods, the moisture given to the humans through rain. So a lot of violence in this space. And here we bring the story of Hernan Cortez, whose dates are there from 1485 to 1547. First of all, this is the guy who conquers the Aztec Empire, and it's really ridiculous to take on an emperor with only 300 conquistadores, these sort of armed mercenaries, armed entrepreneurs, if you will, in the middle of foreign territory. How does this happen? In 1519, Cortez lands in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's not the first one there, but he lands in 1519, and he scuttles his ships according to legend, so that the soldiers only had one way in. and they begin to fight the locals. And listen, the old explanations were that Aztecs are fearing the horses. They were indeed excited about the horses. They were worried about the cannons. But, if you're 300, how do you take on an army of 10,000 multiple times over? So what happens is that they gain allies. So it's 300 soldiers, right? 15 horsemen, 15 cannons, but they have hundreds and hundreds of indigenous carriers and warriors who, get this, are ready to help them to topple the evil empire. They want them to topple the Aztecs. So they begin marching towards the capital city. And the Aztecs have a way of fighting, which is that they fight to capture, not to kill. Europeans fight to kill. So you can see how this gives them an advantage. Meanwhile, diseases are wrecking all the local populations, which made resistance all the more difficult. And listen, these folks weren't foolish. We look at Aztec writings and listen, when you fight the Spanish and they have the cannons, don't run in a straight line, run in a zigzag pattern towards the Spanish. Okay, so some of these things were close run. Eventually, he makes it to the capital city, and he meets the Aztec emperor, a gentleman named Moctezuma. He meets Moctezuma, and he invents a technique which becomes copied by other conquistadors, which is he takes them captive in the royal palace. In close combat, the Spanish, in their heavy armor with their guns, have an advantage. He holds them ransom. Eventually he's given all the wealth of Moctezuma. He becomes the richest European in human history. And then he kills him. And then he fights his way out of the city, and he convinces the allies to recognize him as the heir to Moctezuma. Eventually more Spanish come, and almost overnight, there's a new ruler in Tenochtitlan, also known as Mexico City, and that is the Spanish. But we need to sort of explain why this happens. All right. One option, as you can see in this famous Diego Rivera painting in 1957, a famous mid-century Mexican genius and artist, is the story of superior technology. The Europeans came in with guns. All right, pardon that delay. So one answer has been superior technology. Right, you can see this in Diego Rivera's famous painting. It portrays Spanish soldiers with muskets and horses mowing down brave but technology outgunned Indians. It looks at religion being complicit in this, and so forth. Another option, here is Diego Rivera, the philandering husband of Frida Kahlo, really fascinating story. Here he is in New York City. So a communist once was able to create art in New York. Okay. So one explanation is that it was simple technology. But as I said earlier, this is a period where it took 3 minutes to load a gun, right? So it's not just technology. Another option, which is fascinating, is culture. The Aztecs curiously had a culture of immense hospitality. Nelson, I did talk about the pillaging and the killing and so forth, but they brought in most of their folks by sort of having a great feast, by showing kindness on them. As you can see in this image, they were given, looks like, pigeons and foods. The conquistadors talk about being with many, many women and so forth. So many sort of splendid treats, so to speak, are given to the Europeans. And Moctezuma, before he's captured, thinks that he can use hospitality. He's the one who thinks he's in control. Of course, we now know that he has underestimated the intentions of the Europeans, but he's the one who thinks he's in control, and he can sort of lure him in with great gifts, and then the conquistadors and Hernan Cortez will head back to where they came from. That's part of the explanation. But I think a third explanation has the most explanatory power, and that is that Europeans had what we might call epistemological superiority. Epistemological superiority. What does this mean? Epistemology is to know, right? They had more information on hand. They had more information on hand because they had access to a woman known as Donna Marina. Who is she? Or sometimes she's known as Malinche, which is, as I understand it, literally means traitor or someone of dubious loyalty. So she's the daughter of a nobleman of one of the subjected tribes of the Aztecs. Her dad dies and her mom remarries, and she becomes a stepchild. Very famous story. Meanwhile, a shipwrecked Spanish sailor, a couple of years before Hernan Cortez lands, shows up off the coast of the Yucatan, and she's given to him as a concubine, or as like a sex slave, and she learns Spanish. A few years later, Cortez lands. The Spanish guy's pumped. He says, "Hey, it's really great to see you. Can I join your group? Oh, by the way, I've got this wife here. She speaks Nahuatl, Nawatl, Nahuatl. And now she knows Spanish." So Donna Marina / Malinche goes with the expedition all the way to Mexico. So the Europeans have this enormous advantage in that they can say something and understand the other side, and the Aztecs don't have this power. The Europeans control the translations of the story. And I think that's crucial in the political dynamics because the way they did this was by getting allies from other people. The Europeans have the ability to trick, to empathize, and to manipulate the other. And she's always at the center of all of this. And she's the one who's saying, hey, listen, we're here to topple the evil Aztecs, right? Or if there was a tribe that was loyal to the Aztecs, they would say, we're here to pay, subservience. In other words, we're here to pay our respects to the mighty emperor. But notice how she's always, in all these pictures, there's always a woman at the center. In many ways, the most important player of all this is the story of Donna Marina, who has a child of Cortez, and that child is the first known mixed race child, to use modern conceptions, in Mexico and in South America. And over the course of history, there's been many ways is really a tragic version of inequality, as most people are mestiza, right? And there's this caste system where people of Central and South America who have more Spanish or Portuguese or European heritage blood usually have access to more influence and status in society. And here I invite you to watch a film. This is actually extra credit if you'd like to. There's a wonderful film by Alfonso Cuarón. He did Gravity, won Best Picture 4 or 5 years ago. It's called Roma. It's in black and white, and it tells the story of these Nahuatl women, these indigenous Mexican women, with sort of heritage dating back to the Aztecs, who are sort of the help, the servants to these more elite, Euro-Mexican family. Check out this film. It's a film with incredibly beauty. I love this film. And, option C, the epistemological argument, also is really good at explaining what happens in South America. So a few years after Columbus takes over Mexico, there's a whole gang of conquistadors who attempt to do similar things. One of them was Francisco Pizarro, who signed his name with an X. Yes, that means he's illiterate. An illiterate European man conquers the Andes in South America. So he arrives in 1532, so about a decade later. He's an illiterate or mercenary, and he happens upon the Inca Empire. Now, the Incas was one of the largest states in the world, rivaling China and the Ottoman Empire in size. And he arrives there, and he's got a few things going for him. For starters, the Inca Empire had built this amazing road up and that's 3,700 miles long. Most of it you can still hike from Colombia all the way down to Chile. Right here are some images of these old Inca roads. So, Francisco Pizarro's like, oh, great, there's these roads. We can just walk right along them. Right? Here's the road overlooking Cuzco. Some more of these roads. Oh, my goodness, this is Machu Picchu. You should definitely do this. And as they're hiking along these roads, they've got a few advantages. Number one, everyone's dying of smallpox. So people are trying to save themselves from the European disease. Number two, they've got this road. Number three, they've got a translator. And this is important. This epistemological superiority of translation is important because there's a civil war going on. In the Inca Empire, the way that they had succession for their Pachacuti, their great leaders, their emperors, was that the Pachacuti, or the emperor, would have many sons with several mothers, usually from different regions in the empire, and the best and brightest son would succeed the father. Now, this sounds great on paper, right? You don't want a dud out of male to become a king. But what happens is all the mamas think their son is the best and brightest son. So civil war during these transitions of power was not uncommon. And there is a civil war going on just as Pizarro and some of his conquistadors are heading into the Andes. So they make it all the way to the capital city. And he knows how this works from Hernan Cortez in Tenochtitlan in Mexico City. He arranges a meeting with Atahualpa, who had just won the Civil War, and he captures him. He's given all his wealth, and then he murders him. And before you know it, the Inca Empire becomes what's called the Viceroyalty of Peru, in which Pizarro, now a wealthy man, pays homage to the King and Queen of Spain. And in Mexico, the Aztec Empire becomes the Viceroyalty of Spain. Fast forward a couple hundred years, these regions push for independence, most famously under the direction of Simón Bolívar, but that's a story for a different day. Now, I want to talk about the reality of this, because how does this happen? Almost overnight, these huge empires go European, and almost overnight, these huge empires become Christian. What's fascinating is that even though the Incas and the Aztecs had no European contact, they had essentially similar medieval styles of government. At the very top, there was an emperor. Right below, there was the priests and the general. And below that, the public population. This sort of feudal class system was kind of the same. So when the Spanish take over, for most folks, it's just like another guy at the top who's going to tell them what to do in their life, make their life better or worse, but that's just the way it is. So it's really quite fascinating. Similar styles help this transition. Now, I do want to kind of pause here and say, this wasn't always, these Europeans falling to luck and fortune. There were many stories of misfortune. And if someone chooses the film for this week, that's a film by a director named Werner Herzog. He was 26 years old in the early 1970s. He's German. This is a German film. It's also one of the greatest films of all time, according to all sorts of critics. He doesn't pay them. They go to the Andes, and they shoot a film about a guy named Lope de Aguirre, who is nicknamed El Loco, right? The crazy one. And he leads a madcap scheme to find El Dorado, which, of course, is non-existent. Everyone dies to the last man. So not all European adventures were successful, like Pizarro and Cortez. Another reality is that this was a demographic disaster. There's a huge, fascinating academic argument about how large the population was. Some experts have it at 18 million. Some experts have it at 30, a pretty common understanding. Just this month, people said the population is actually a lot lower if you look at genetic evidence. We'll see how this plays out. But let's say we take the high number of 30 million. The estimated population at the point of European contact in 1492. We do know that the population of the indigenous population by 1595 is about 1.5 to 2 million. That's a gigantic difference. But 80 to 90% of the population passed. So this is some part of, and this is they just didn't have the immune systems for simple things like smallpox. So folks, get your smallpox shot, get your flu shots, get your COVID shots. Europeans also got some new things, namely syphilis, right? And STD heads over to Europe. Eventually, King Henry VIII gets it and dies of it. But look at this map. You can see the tremendous population decline. So when Europeans come, there's a transition of power. Everyone dies. Also, everyone becomes Christian. Of course, not everyone, but almost overnight. Right, the Aztec and Inca temples are transitioned to become the great churches. So the oldest structures in the Americas, right, are these magnificent now Catholic Christian cathedrals, like the Mission San Miguel, southern Brazil, right, the famous Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, also known as Tenochtitlan. Right here you see Peru. This was once a puma-shaped temple turned into a Christian cathedral. And what's fascinating, some of you have maybe watched the film Coco, big fan of Coco, big fan of that Pixar film. There's the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And this is sort of this cultural memory of precisely at the time everyone becomes Christian is also the time that everyone dies. Now, I start with this story, the story of European encounters in the Americas, in part because this is how the world becomes connected, not just for obvious reasons. Okay, now they're Europeans in the Americas, but this goes to the whole world. How does this work? How does it get back to China, for example? In a word, silver. Silver is discovered both in central Mexico and most centrally in a great silver mountain in Potosi, Bolivia. Between the two of them, they begin producing 85% of the world's silver. That's impressive. And this fuels a gigantic expansion of Spanish politics and arts and more generally the European economy. Look at the population growth of Potosi, where silver was discovered in 1542. 5 years later, in 1547, there's 14,000 people living there. By 1571, there's 40,000 people living there. By 1600, there's 150,000 people living here. And folks, at the time, Paris is around 120,000 people, right? So Potosi, Bolivia is bigger than the largest city in Europe. This is a multi-ethnic world filled with locals, right? 76,000 Indians, 8,000 African slaves, 3,000 Spanish, 40,000 other Europeans, 35,000 Creole or mixed race folks. And Europeans now have access to one thing that the Chinese, the wealthiest people in the world, want, and that is silver. There's a shortage of silver in China. So now the world is truly connected because of silver. But of course, this all works because of the system of slavery. In essence, they work people to death. It's really quite sad. All right. You know, this is a story of a lot of energy. Brave, malevolent, tragic. I want to look at the life of one individual as we close out this lecture who uses his agency, uses his, Imago Dei, his humanity to change the system. So after the Spanish arrived, they begin to settle this region. They establish something called encomiendas. Makes a brief appearance in your textbook. The quick hint, what is an encomienda? It means that Europeans were given land and also the people in that land for labor. In return, they were to provide protection. They were to also give them the basic needs and to convert them to Christianity. All right, so here in the slide, you can see the plan. Spanish settlers protect, care for, and Christianize the Indians. Indians work a portion of the time for the Spanish settlers. However, the reality is that the Spanish settlers force long labor, don't pay Indian workers, fail to protect the Indians, seize Indian lands, don't teach them Christianity also, and most of these Indians die from disease and harsh living conditions. Now, in this slide, you can see that the encomienda ends after clergy protests. Let's look at that. As an aside, with all this happening, we have the Columbian Exchange. If you take AP high school history, this may be important to you, but there you can see all the new foods that people are getting. And Europeans famously get the potato, which is a big thing because now you can feed a lot more people. So the population in Europe booms with the introduction of the potato. Okay. I want to close, and you're reading a source document from Bartolomé de las Casas. So here's a guy. He's born in Sevilla in southern Spain in 1484. He arrives in Hispaniola. Goodness, is that Cuba or Jamaica? I forget. In 1502, with a land grant, with an encomienda, he's ready to seek his fortune. Now, while he's there, a Dominican friar nurtured his interest in religion and the priesthood, as well as towards the suffering of the native inhabitants. So in 1509, Las Casas renounces his encomienda, his land grant. He released his slaves, and he returned to Rome to take his religious vows. He comes back a couple years later, an ordained priest, the first ordained priest in the Americas. And he denounced the Spanish exploitation of the Indians and the military conquest of the new rule. Now, this was a key moment for his change of heart, from conquistador to person of conscience. He reads in the Sirach text in the Catholic tradition, which says, ill-gotten goods offered in sacrifice are tainted. Presents from the lawless do not win God's favor. The Most High is not pleased with the gifts of the godless, nor for their many sacrifices does he forgive their sins. So, he begins to put pressure on the Spanish for attempting to be better Christians. In 1537, he forces a papal bull, an official letter from the church that declares all Indians free. A few years later, he publishes a tract that you're reading from called "The Devastation of the Indias." Okay. When this was released, everybody in Europe was reading this. It was a #1 bestseller. Everyone is reading about what this priest thinks Spanish are doing. He asked the question, who are the true dogs? It's not the natives who are true in spirit and virtuous, but in fact the Spanish. Right? He describes what's happening here with the deaths of many of the laborers, right? Children being beaten. Truly horrific imagery accompanies his destruction of the Indies. Eventually, there is a debate in Spain where a gentleman named Sepulveda argues for the encomienda system. He rationalized Spanish treatment of the American Indians by arguing that Indians were, quote, natural slaves, and that the Spanish presence in the New World would benefit them. He argued that human sacrifice of the innocents, cannibalism, and other such crimes against nature were unacceptable and should be suppressed by any means possible, including war. Basically saying what the Aztecs did, that was everyone, even though it was just the Aztecs. Now, Las Casas counters. At this point, he's a bishop. He argues that the Native Americans, sometimes referred to as Amerindians, were free men in the natural order, despite their practice of despite Aztec practice of human sacrifices and other such customs, and they deserve the same consideration as other colonizers. In short, he said this: all races of the world are men, and all men of each individual there is known defection, and this is that they are rational. All have understanding and free will and free choice, as all are made in the image and likeness of God. All the world is human. So he becomes known as this father of anti-imperialism, this father of anti-racism, this father of modern human rights. And in many ways, he's remembered as a saint by the indigenous peoples of the New World. Indeed, these arguments would become common in the fight to end slavery and the declaration of human rights around the entire world. And change happened. Las Casas won in his day. But the reality didn't really affect change too much on the ground. So, we're at the 1 hour mark. I need to finish. This will be one of the longer lectures of the semester. But the European encounters in America, it was filled with many things. It was filled with triumph. It was filled with tragedy. And I invite you to reflect in your uh, open LMS discussions how we should make sense of this. How do you think about this ethically as a human? How do you think about it historically? What is beautiful and tragic about this? Could there have been a different way? I'm looking forward to the chat. Take care, folks. Godspeed.